Hey there. You're listening to True Story No Cap. Real stories, no exaggeration, no lies. Just the raw, unfiltered moments life throws our way. Relax, lean back, and let's get started. Sarah was walking from the bus stop towards her house. It was the very beginning of spring, and it was getting dark noticeably later than usual. Just a couple of weeks ago at this time, complete darkness reigned, but now the sky was colored only by pale lilac twilight. In her hands she carried 2 bags of groceries, fruit for Emily, fresh bread, and a good piece of meat, enough to make 2 different dishes. Of course there were sweets too. How could she go without them, especially after receiving her advance payment? Tomorrow was a day off, the perfect day for their traditional Friday movie night with Emily, who had already chosen some comedy. A smile touched Sarah's lips. If anything truly made her life happy, full, and meaningful, it was her daughter, who was now 8 years old. Emily studied at the local school and was an excellent student, although Sarah helped her with homework almost never, only occasionally participating in extra projects. Sarah really wanted to spend more time with her child, but she had to work a lot to provide for the 2 of them. Fortunately, Emily managed wonderfully on her own. She was responsible, smart, serious, and very independent for her age. Since the 1st grade, Emily had had to do many things alone: leave for school when Sarah was already halfway to work, return to an empty apartment after lessons, clean up, eat lunch, do homework, and set her alarm clock so she wouldn't be late for practice. Emily was in the basketball section, and the coach noted her iron character and great prospects in the sport. She was simply a wonderful child. Thinking about Emily, Sarah smiled again. She was incredibly lucky with her child, and yet, with pain in her heart, she watched other children who were accompanied everywhere by caring adults, loving grandmothers and grandfathers, stay-at-home mothers, fathers. These girls and boys had more time for games. They were constantly cared for and looked after. The presence of adults made the children's lives happier, brighter, and safer. At first, Sarah was very anxious letting her little girl go alone with a huge backpack on her shoulders. Colleagues often expressed surprise and concern. They asked if she wasn't afraid that a bad person would take the child, or a dog would attack, or Emily would get lost. Sarah just sighed because all these fears, of course, were present, but she was confident in her daughter, knowing that she wouldn't go with a stranger, would avoid a pack of dogs, and would always find her way home. Emily was surprisingly mature, attentive, sensitive, and intelligent. Besides, Sarah simply had no other choice. She couldn't afford to stay home with her child, or even change jobs to something closer. The factory where she worked as an economist paid well, and getting the job had cost her enormous effort. Her salary now exceeded the city average, and although she and Emily didn't live extravagantly, there was enough money for clothes, apartment rent, groceries, and even small entertainments. If her income decreased, they simply wouldn't survive. And then her former mother-in-law, whom Sarah remembered with a shudder, would be able to carry out her long-held plan. Martha seemed like a terrible person, although once she had made a completely different impression: sweet, open, and kind. Many years ago, when her son brought a girl who was already pregnant to meet his parents, she was very nervous. She understood perfectly well how their situation looked from the outside. A village girl without means or connections had charmed a guy from a rich family, deliberately gotten pregnant to force him to marry her. It all looked as if the young man was simply obliged to marry her as an honest and noble person. In reality, everything was completely different, but even her classmates, who knew Sarah well, expressed similar assumptions. One of them, red-haired and straightforward, sincerely praised her upon hearing the news. She said that Sarah seemed so quiet and proper, yet she had managed to arrange her life in a way others could only dream of. Jessica added that Sarah would now live in plenty and deny herself nothing, calling it an excellent plan worth trying to replicate. The girls weren't being malicious. They were genuinely happy for their friend who, as they thought, had pulled off a risky scheme and won, getting a proposal from an enviable groom. Perhaps it was after such a reaction from her friends that Sarah realized everyone else thought exactly the same way. And her future husband's parents, of course, would look at her as an enemy. Of course, a limit from the village had come to the city and decided to settle here through a successful marriage. Her future husband David was indeed from a very wealthy family, but Sarah didn't find out about this right away. David dressed simply: jeans, t-shirts, comfortable sneakers instead of expensive shoes. Yes, his watch and mobile phone were expensive, but a village girl didn't understand the cost of such accessories. A watch was a watch, A phone was a phone. He usually came to the university on a motorcycle, and Sarah thought bikes weren't expensive, unlike the expensive cars driven by other students from rich families. Besides, David worked part-time at a large real estate firm in an unskilled position like a courier. Therefore, the presence of a motorcycle didn't surprise her. Sarah thought he had saved up for it from his salary or taken out a loan. At the beginning of their relationship, he didn't talk much about the fact that the firm belonged to his father. Sarah couldn't even imagine that his parents were so successful and wealthy. Sarah had watched the young man from afar for a long time. They studied in different departments. He was a student in the prestigious finance and economics program, which Sarah herself had very much wanted to enter after school. She studied hard, poring over textbooks day and night, but she didn't get into that department. The poor village girl desperately wanted to escape poverty. She had wonderful parents, kind, understanding, always supporting her, but Sarah didn't want to repeat their fate. They lived in a small house without plumbing, washed at a huge washstand on the wall, and the toilet was outside. The bathhouse was heated only on weekends. Mary and John worked hard, but there wasn't enough money in the family, as was the case for many in their village, where there was an objective lack of jobs and wages were tiny. People didn't despair, they survived, but Sarah didn't wish such a lot for herself. Mary and John supported their daughter in her desire to get an education and stay living in the city. They even tried not to burden her with household chores so she could devote all her time to studying. Mary instructed her to study, not be lazy, hoping that her daughter would make something of herself, because she had a good head on her shoulders. John echoed this, saying that her teacher considered her smart and promising. Sarah was indeed the best in her class. Studying came easily to her. She viewed the university entrance exams as a decisive battle for a happy life and endured it with dignity. Based on the exam results, she scored many points, pleasantly surprising herself, but it was still not enough to get into the state-funded spots in the finance and economics department. Sarah felt disappointment mixed with surprise. How could this be? In her school, she was head and shoulders above others, and why had so many people surpassed her? Later, she learned about tutors who coached applicants and about gifts to the dean's office. At the time, she blamed herself, thinking she hadn't prepared well enough. She was only a few points short of getting a state-funded spot, but she easily qualified for the commercial program. An unfamiliar senior student, Chloe, seeing her crying by the results board, tried to comfort her, suggesting she study on a paid basis for a year or two and then transfer to a state-funded spot, as many do. Chloe said that with such scores, Sarah clearly had brains, and such students were liked and promoted. Sarah just shook her head, understanding that even a year's tuition fee was an unbearable burden for her family. She had already decided that the year was lost. She would have to return to the village and prepare for admission again, this time more seriously, although even that didn't guarantee success. But that very comforter, the random senior student, offered a completely different solution. She shrugged, asking why Sarah needed a prestigious program where mostly connected people and children of rich parents studied. Chloe claimed that the education there was practically the same as in the enterprise economics department, where it was even better and less pretentious. How grateful Sarah was to her accidental savior. She later tried to find Chloe, talk to her, and say thank you, but she never could. It turned out that her scores were more than enough for the other department, and so she finally became a student. As a village girl, she was given a dormitory room and a social scholarship. Sarah couldn't believe her luck for a long time. She studied diligently, attended all lectures, submitted term papers on time, and always did her homework. Professors praised her and held her up as an example to others, which sometimes made her a little uncomfortable. Sarah devoted all her time and energy to studying, but she also had to work 2 or 3 hours in the evening as a salesperson in the bakery nearest to the dormitory, as the scholarship wasn't enough to live on. Her parents, despite all their desire, couldn't help, and Sarah made do as best she could. Naturally, she had no time for clubs, discos, and student parties, which sometimes made her sad, but remembering her goal quickly put everything back in perspective. Her classmates often enthusiastically talked about their weekends, shared details of romantic adventures, and vividly described their admirers. At such moments, Sarah also dreamed of a worthy young man. Loving, caring, cheerful, handsome, of course. Someone she could fall head over heels in love with. But the guys who came into her field of vision didn't fit the role of a prince. Many were handsome and cheerful, but seemed too carefree, frivolous, and selfish. Sarah couldn't imagine tying her fate to any of them. Her friends jokingly called her a bore and warned her of a lonely old age surrounded by cats when she refused to go to another party. And then, in her 4th year, Sarah finally saw a guy who didn't leave her indifferent. It was strange how she hadn't noticed him before. The young man expertly zoomed into the parking lot on a black motorcycle, dressed in jeans, a black t-shirt, with a helmet on his head. What attracted her then? The skill with which he handled the iron horse, or his special graceful posture? At that moment, he reminded her of a prince on a noble steed. Anyway, Sarah, who was hurrying to the library, stopped and watched from afar as the motorcyclist dismounted and took off his helmet. For some reason, she really wanted to see his eyes. It would have been better if she hadn't, because when he, as if sensing her gaze, looked in her direction, Sarah knew she was lost. Piercing turquoise eyes in a tanned face, a snow-white smile, thick hair of an incredible wheat shade. She could have admired him endlessly, if not for the rules of decency. Sarah suddenly felt awkward, standing and staring at the stranger. What would he think? She turned sharply and hurried towards the library building. David caught up with her almost at the entrance, gently holding her arm. Sarah turned around and blushed, meeting his slightly mocking gaze. The stranger smiled at her warmly, openly, sincerely. Sarah had never felt such feelings before. It was difficult to describe. Goosebumps ran down her back and neck, warmth spread through her body, her heart pounded like crazy. That day their romance began. At first beautiful, like a magical fairy tale, but ending more like a bad horror movie. The young man confessed that he had felt her gaze and understood by her eyes that he could be happy with her. Later, analyzing the situation, Sarah realized that David at that moment was simply oversaturated with beautiful, spoiled, and selfish girls from rich families who couldn't be surprised by anything. And here was a simple, unsophisticated, and also very pretty girl from the village. She looked at him with loving eyes, hung on his every word, admired everything he did or said, rejoiced at trifles like a bouquet of roses, and was amazed by the luxury of restaurants. David found it interesting to observe the behavior and emotions of an unspoiled girl. He was the one who opened a new world to her, which made his head spin, instilled faith in his own power, and tickled his ego. Of course, he also developed some feelings for the girl, for whom he was everything. Otherwise, it would be impossible. But he never intended to make her the center of his universe. Sarah realized all this later when problems began. At first, however, it seemed to her that he was performing one feat after another for her. David didn't spare money on Sarah. She felt awkward. At first, she even tried to refuse, knowing perfectly well that money didn't come easily. He worked as a courier and earned money, but that didn't mean he had to spend it all on her. David just smiled at all her objections and gave her another luxurious gift. Their relationship resembled sometimes a romantic comedy, sometimes a beautiful melodrama. He was so sweet, attentive, incredibly charming in his courtship, and always knew how to cheer Sarah up. Sarah still devoted a lot of time to her studies, but now lectures and seminars didn't make up her whole life. Amazingly, there was enough time for everything, for dates with David and for poring over notebooks. It was a wonderful, unforgettable time. They had been dating for about a year when Sarah realized with horror that she was expecting a child. At first, she couldn't believe it. They had been so careful. But one test after another showed 2 bright lines, and the fact had to be accepted. Sarah was in despair. Her diploma was due, state exams were coming, the final stretch. She had worked towards this for so long. Perhaps the pregnancy itself wouldn't prevent her from preparing for the final tests. She would write her diploma and pass the exams, but by the end of her 5th year, she would have a huge belly. Who would hire her like that? She would have to stay home and take care of the child. And what had these 5 years of study been for then? Would David be happy about this news? Would he take responsibility for her and the child? Their relationship was elevated, trusting. But a beautiful romance was one thing, and a burden in the form of a pregnant girl was another. She cried for about an hour from despair, resentment, and fear for the future. Then she calmed down and decided to tell everything to the person on whom her fate depended. David took the news of the pregnancy unexpectedly joyfully. For him, it was still a game. His eyes lit up, a smile appeared on his face. He exclaimed that they would become parents, they would have their own little one, it was cool. He was happy about the child, like a new toy, but Sarah didn't notice it then. She was happy that the man she loved didn't perceive the pregnancy as a problem. Looking at him hopefully, she asked what they would do now. He smiled, putting his arms around her shoulders, and replied that they would get married, finish their studies, Then he would go to work and she would go on maternity leave. Sarah was very worried about housing. She would soon be asked to leave the dormitory. Would she have to move into David's apartment? Living with his relatives would probably be difficult. She would have to adjust and get used to it. David shrugged and said they would live in his apartment, which his father had given him long ago. It was large, spacious, she would like it. He would have moved there long ago, but his mother had set a condition that he could only do so when he got married. And now he was getting married. Sarah still couldn't believe he had an apartment. She asked who his parents were, as she knew little about his family. He preferred to change the subject. David frowned annoyedly, asking what there was to tell about them. Parents were parents. His mother was a housewife. She had spent her whole life looking after him and his brothers, taking them to clubs. She had 3 sons. He had mentioned this. Sarah nodded. He had indeed mentioned 2 older brothers. David continued that his mother took care of the house and his father ran his own business, a real estate agency. He asked if he hadn't told her this. Sarah shook her head. He had never said that the firm where he was a courier was owned by his own father. Now he was saying it. So she didn't need to worry. There would be a place to live. By the way, he needed to introduce her to his parents. Now his mother would be happy. She thought he had his head in the clouds, always holding up his older brothers as examples, saying they were serious, unlike him. Now she would find out that he was responsible too. Sarah was very afraid of meeting his parents. David was completely confident that his fiancée would be liked by both his father and mother. Sarah herself doubted this very much. Of course, no one would believe that she hadn't guessed his wealth. Even her friends thought she had deliberately gotten pregnant by a rich kid. What would his relatives say? But the introduction went more than successfully. Despite the fact that Sarah was initially flustered by the luxurious interiors of the mansion where the family lived. A table was set in the living room, everything looked appetizing, but from nerves, she couldn't swallow a bite. The parents introduced themselves. Her future mother-in-law, Martha, smiled openly at her guest. She had the same piercing turquoise eyes as her son. Sarah was amazed by Martha's appearance. This woman was much older than Sarah's own mother, but there were no wrinkles on Martha's face. A slim, toned figure, flawless skin, a stylish, elegant dress. David's father also didn't look his age, fit, energetic. In conversation, the parents, despite all their wealth, turned out to be pleasant and simple people. Upon learning Sarah's story, Martha was delighted. She praised her, calling her smart and someone who had achieved a lot through her own hard work, noting her amazing determination. David's father joined the conversation, saying that he needed such people and promised to hire her after her maternity leave, so she didn't need to worry about work. Sarah couldn't believe her happiness then. Everything happening seemed like a beautiful fairy tale. The parents not only showed no dissatisfaction with a poor pregnant daughter-in-law, but, on the contrary, were sincerely happy to see her. Martha, smiling at Sarah, shook her head and said that their rascal needed exactly this kind of girl by his side, responsible, serious, hard-working. She believed they were very lucky to have met. Sarah didn't understand then why the parents called their son a rascal. He seemed to be a quite serious and sensible young man. Well, of course, he sometimes rode his motorcycle riskily, there was that. And he spent a lot of time with friends, but he was still very young and carefree. It was natural that he wanted to have fun. When else to do it but in youth? The parents organized a lavish wedding for the young couple. Sarah was embarrassed that they covered all the expenses. Her own parents also felt awkward. But Martha behaved so simply and naturally that the tension gradually evaporated. She spoke very kindly and respectfully to Sarah's mother and father, and even thanked them for raising such a wonderful daughter. She smiled warmly at her daughter-in-law and showered her with compliments. Sarah, in a dress that Martha had helped choose and paid for, truly looked like a real princess and carried herself accordingly. Her young husband was proud that his wife was so beautiful. For the first half of the wedding, he didn't let go of her hand. But then, when the official part was over, David, as always, ran off to his friends. Sarah was happy for her new husband then. She liked that he was so sociable and cheerful. Family life at first also resembled a fairy tale. Sarah now lived in a huge, stylishly furnished apartment that she had previously only seen in fashion magazines. It took her a long time to get used to being the full mistress of all this splendor. She got her own card, onto which a round sum magically appeared twice a month. David transferred money for household expenses. Accustomed to saving, Sarah at first didn't even manage to spend her salary. It was so wonderful and unusual to go to the store and throw everything she liked into the cart instead of looking for discounted products. Her relationship with David's parents was excellent. Sarah considered them family. Martha often invited her daughter-in-law over, and they talked for a long time. Sarah told her about her life, and Martha told her about hers. It turned out that Martha had also been born and raised in a village, and then her family moved to the city where, still very young, she met her future husband, the father of their 3 sons. She recalled that he was a simple accountant at a factory then, and later he started his own business, which she helped and supported, so it was their joint venture. And Martha often said that she had dreamed of having a daughter all her life. She wanted a daughter so much, but only boys were born. The youngest son was born only because she hoped for a girl. It was her last attempt. And here was another boy, and, strangely enough, the most loved of all 3, although at first she was, of course, very disappointed, being sure she was carrying a daughter. Her 2 older sons gave her a total of 4 grandsons. So even there she didn't get to cuddle a beautiful baby girl. Martha dreamed of buying dolls for her granddaughter, braiding her hair, choosing beautiful dresses, doing everything she had wanted to do with a daughter. But here were boys again, toy trains, construction sets, cars. She, of course, adored them, but she so wanted something cute, girly, pink. All her hope was now on her daughter-in-law. Before this revelation from Martha, Sarah hadn't cared what sex the baby would be. But after that, Sarah suddenly realized that she too dreamed of a little girl with turquoise eyes like her father's and long, beautiful hair. It really was wonderful. To braid hair, tie ribbons, dress the little one in pink dresses. But David, on the contrary, dreamed of a son. That's what he said. Although Sarah increasingly began to feel that this child didn't matter to him at all. He spent a lot of time at work, and in the evenings and on weekends, he ran off to his friends. This was so unlike the beginning of their relationship. Sarah hoped that when the baby was born, her young husband would settle down, but she was mistaken. Everything got even worse. Emily was born on time. When the tiny red creature was placed on Sarah's chest, she understood. From this moment on, her life was divided into before and after. Now she was a mother. David and his parents arranged a lavish discharge from the hospital. There was everything. An entertainer in a bear costume, pink and white balloons, flowers, happy and touched relatives, and a cameraman who captured every moment. Martha tenderly took the pink bundle into her arms. Finally, her long-held dream had come true. She had a granddaughter, long awaited and loved. David, of course, also seemed happy and even willingly posed with Emily in his arms, but Sarah immediately noticed that he was bored with it all. There was no genuine joy in the young father's eyes, not even a glimmer of the delight that she or Martha felt. Family life flowed on. Sarah was completely immersed in caring for Emily. Martha often visited the young mother and her newborn girl, teaching her how to care for an infant. Sarah was a first-time mother and didn't really know anything, but the learning wasn't that complicated, and very soon she felt confident. But Martha continued to visit, and Sarah didn't object, seeing how she rejoiced in her long-awaited granddaughter. It was wonderful that someone else besides the parents loved the child, especially since David wasn't very interested in Emily. She rather annoyed him. He frowned when the girl started crying, especially after bedtime, and complained about sleepless nights. No, he didn't get up for the child. Sarah always rushed to her. It was just that these nightly commotions interfered with the head of the family's proper sleep. David spent more and more time away from home. He might not even come home to sleep. To all his wife's questions, he replied that he wasn't her slave and had the right to rest from family. Gradually, the rose-colored glasses fell from Sarah's eyes. David showed himself as he was. This was why Martha called her youngest son a rascal and insisted he had his head in the clouds. He turned out to be completely unprepared for family life. The worries about a small child weighed on him. At family celebrations, he happily held his charming, dressed-up daughter in his arms. His wife saw that he was simply admiring himself and proud of his new role as a father. But on ordinary days, he avoided any contact with the little one. He now preferred not to talk to his wife, which was hurtful and confusing. In the end, Sarah, of course, found out what was going on. For the first time, she accidentally overheard her husband's conversation. One morning, he thought his faithful wife was sleeping soundly after rocking their daughter for 3 hours. Emily had been unwell just before. She had been capricious the day before and would only nap in her mother's arms. But Sarah was too exhausted to close her eyes and, of course, heard everything. Although David tried to speak quietly, he was cooing with some girl, apparently very young, calling her Bunny and my love, laughing in response to her remarks, promising that they would have fun soon. Sarah lay in bed, barely restraining herself from the desire to burst into the kitchen and make a scene, but it wouldn't have led to anything. David had long since become practically a stranger to her. Yes, they lived together, and importantly, he fully provided for her and Emily. But what could she herself give Emily if she left him now? She had to pretend that nothing had happened. Since then, Sarah often noticed signs of her husband's infidelity. Girls called him when he was home. David hardly hid it. Of course, in his wife's presence, he spoke more restrainedly than when, in his opinion, she couldn't hear anything. He might come home in the morning, explaining it as an important business meeting. At the same time, a bracelet from a nightclub often adorned his wrist, and his clothes frankly smelled of women's perfume. And sometimes he would go on another business trip for 5 to 7 days, from which he invariably returned refreshed, rested, and sometimes even tanned, clearly under the southern sun. Sarah endured all this, feeling humiliated, crushed, lost, and broken during this period. After all, she still loved her husband and until recently believed that he also had feelings for her. Well, yes, he had cooled down a bit, it happens, especially after the arrival of a child. For some men, it's a test of strength. And it turned out he had an affair, probably even affairs, as he addressed his young and undoubtedly beautiful interlocutors differently. After putting her tiny daughter to bed, Sarah often cried, curled up in a ball on the armchair near the crib. She understood that she was in a desperate situation. Living with a husband who cheated left and right was unbearable. At the same time, he had long since looked at her, his lawful wife, as nothing. And when was the last time they had a heart-to-heart talk? Sarah couldn't remember. She had to break up otherwise. She would soon completely lose herself. But what next? Where could she go with a small daughter in her arms? To a rented apartment again, of course. But she would have to go back to work. Emily was still very young. She would probably be sick a lot in kindergarten, like all small children. Who would need such an employee constantly running off on sick leave? It was unlikely she would find a job during this difficult period. Returning to the village was also a bad idea. Sarah herself had once made every effort to escape from there, and now to live in a tiny house without normal conditions again, and moreover condemn her daughter to such an existence? No, she had to come up with something else. Martha continued to visit her daughter-in-law and granddaughter frequently. Each time she gave Emily luxurious gifts, dresses from famous designers, tiny gold earrings, expensive dolls, interesting toys. It was clear that the elderly woman adored the girl. Sarah, as the mother of this long-awaited princess, also received gifts and attention. The sensitive Martha had long noticed that her daughter-in-law looked sad and thoughtful. She asked directly many times, but Sarah always evaded answers, citing lack of sleep or a headache. No, Martha was a wonderful person. Sarah had no doubt about that then. But how could she tell her about the humiliation she had to endure day after day? But one day, Sarah realized she had to act. It happened on a rainy autumn evening. David came home late saying he had a business dinner. His wife pretended to believe him, as always. But then she accidentally saw a photograph. David was scrolling through his phone's feed looking at something and smiling happily. Sarah just glanced at the screen and was stunned. There was a photo. He was posing, hugging a beautiful blonde who was smiling broadly and pressing close to him. It was a selfie. And then, as they say, Sarah's visor dropped. Without wanting to, she immediately burst into shouting, asking what that was. David raised his completely calm eyes to her. This photograph, this indifference, this calmness of her husband, who seemed to see nothing unusual in the situation, finally drove her mad. Long-suppressed emotions burst out along with sobs and insults. She called her husband terrible names, shouted hurtful phrases in his face, wanting to hurt him as much as possible. Sarah expected him to start making excuses, maybe even apologize, but he looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust and remained silent. Sarah, suddenly completely losing control, delivered a resounding slap to her husband. She put all her strength into the blow, so it was quite forceful. As if in slow motion, she watched as David's head snapped back. He even had to clutch the table to keep from falling. Sarah got what she wanted. She jolted David out of his state of cold indifference. He looked at her with such malice that she froze in horror. The man strode towards her and grabbed her hair tightly. She fully felt his strong grip, understanding that he could easily crush her. It was clear that David was barely restraining himself. Sarah, with eyes wide with fear for her own life, looked at her husband and blamed herself for the unexpected outburst. David hissed, telling her to listen carefully, that he was saying this once and would not repeat it. If this happened again, she would fly out of this apartment like a cork from a bottle. She would remain the same penniless wretch she was before. She wouldn't see any alimony because his salary was mostly unofficial. She would get pennies. He asked if she understood. Sarah nodded silently. A violent tremor began to shake her. She wanted only one thing, for all this to end quickly. But David didn't let go of her hair. On the contrary, he continued to wrap it around his fist. He asked if she thought he didn't understand that she had deliberately gotten pregnant by a rich guy, and if she thought she was the only one so cunning. He explained that he didn't marry her because of her cunning. First, she used to be quite good-looking. Second, a marriage with someone like her should be easy and uncomplicated. People like her should be happy with the conditions they found themselves in. Raise children, serve her husband, and not open her mouth unnecessarily. Everyone gets their benefit. She gets prosperity, wealth, a calm, secure life. He gets freedom. He asked if this really needed to be explained and spelled out, if it wasn't obvious to her. David pushed his wife away forcefully. She stumbled backward towards the door. The man's eyes were still blazing with fury. Fortunately, he restrained himself and didn't hit her, but he was clearly very close to doing so. Sarah understood at that moment. A similar scene would happen again and again. He would find something to pick on and might hit her. He could easily hit her and would do so sooner or later. After that incident, life went on as usual. David also disappeared somewhere day and night. Now he didn't hide, talking to his girlfriends right in front of his wife. Sarah was no longer just hurt, she was scared. She understood that she couldn't live like this for long. Such an existence was slowly destroying her, but there was no way out. David was right. She had nowhere to go, nothing to live on. And then, in despair, Sarah made the biggest mistake. She turned to Martha for help. She thought Martha treated her well, gave gifts, spoke kindly, complimented her, and Sarah cooked wonderfully and raised Emily correctly. Therefore, Sarah never expected to hear such words from her mother-in-law. Martha shrugged, saying it wasn't surprising, as her son had been a rascal since early childhood. She didn't expect. No, she had once hoped that he would settle down, grow up, but now she clearly saw he was an eternal child. Sarah looked at Martha hopefully, asking what she should do, hoping she would suggest a way out. Martha replied that there was nothing to do now, just live as she was living. Her son would provide for her and Emily from head to toe. She guaranteed that. Well, what could she do? That was the price for a well-fed life. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. She asked if Martha wouldn't even talk to her son. Martha shook her head, seeing no point in it, because he couldn't be changed. Sarah said she couldn't live with him and would divorce him. Martha seemed to start worrying, calling it foolish. How would she manage alone? Alimony would be pennies. She had nowhere to live. Sarah replied that she would go back to her parents in the village. It was better than enduring all this. Emily would grow up, and then she would think about how to move back to the city. Martha became seriously concerned, asking if she would take Emily, meaning Martha wouldn't see her. Sarah assured her that she wouldn't deprive her of contact with her granddaughter. They would visit sometimes, or Martha would visit them, but she couldn't live with her husband anymore. He was cruel, selfish. It was destroying her. Martha clarified if she would see her granddaughter when her daughter-in-law graciously allowed it. It seemed she had missed Sarah's words about her son. She only cared about her granddaughter, the long-awaited, beloved object of grandmother's pride and adoration. Sarah confirmed that that's how it would be, as she was the mother, and it was up to her to decide who the child would see and when. Martha said, "You're mistaken, dear. It's a good thing you confided your plans to me. The child will be left with my son in case of divorce. I will take care of that." Now it was Sarah's turn to be scared. She exclaimed, "No," because usually children were left with their mother in divorces. That's how it always was. Martha replied that yes, but that was if the mother was able to support the child. And what was Sarah going to do, deprive her daughter of normal living conditions? Take her to a remote village, to a house without amenities? And she didn't have a job. And her son had a large, well-appointed apartment, and they would draw up whatever salary was needed in his documents. So she should evaluate her chances herself. In despair, Sarah exclaimed that David didn't need Emily. She hadn't expected such a turn of events at all. Until recently, she had considered Martha a future ally, a helper. To be honest, she had counted on Martha helping her with her granddaughter, both morally and physically, after the divorce. But it turned out that Martha had simply decided to take her daughter away from her. Martha slowly said that she, on the other hand, needed her granddaughter. She had dreamed of a daughter all her life, then a granddaughter, made so many plans, had so many hopes, and now she had a granddaughter. And now her daughter-in-law wanted to take her away? No way. Sarah still found the strength to leave David then. Emily had just turned 3. It wasn't easy. Sarah was greatly supported by her parents and aunt. With their combined efforts, they raised money so their daughter and niece could rent an apartment in the city, well-equipped, clean, spacious, the kind that wouldn't raise questions from the guardianship authorities, to whom Martha, of course, had appealed. Her relatives paid the rent for a full 6 months. During this time, Sarah enrolled Emily in kindergarten and found a job. Now she had good living conditions and a sufficient salary to support her child. That is, Martha couldn't take the girl. But the fight for Emily continues to this day. Sarah hoped that one of Martha's other sons would have a daughter, and she would shift her attention to her. But David, who soon after the divorce married a young woman who looked like a fashion model, became the father of 2 sons. The wife of one of his brothers also gave birth to a boy. So Emily remained Martha's only granddaughter, which is why she didn't give up. Martha constantly wrote complaints about Sarah to the guardianship authorities. Sometimes she wasn't looking after the child, sometimes she was too busy with her personal life, sometimes she treated the girl cruelly. Both Sarah and Mary had grown used to frequent checks by police officers or representatives of the guardianship authorities. Naturally, no violations were found, but Sarah lived in constant fear. What if Martha, a rich and influential woman, came up with something sooner or later, staged some situation? Sarah could no longer imagine life without Emily. The girl was the center of her universe. Everything Sarah did was for her, for Emily. David wasn't interested in Emily's affairs and didn't participate in her life at all, transferring meager alimony from his official earnings, and that was it. This approach suited Sarah perfectly. He didn't interfere with their interactions. Good, less hassle. It was a pity Martha wasn't so indifferent. Now Sarah was hurrying home. Emily was probably already waiting for her mother from work. Sarah had indeed been delayed. She stopped by the shopping center for a minute, but spent almost an hour there. So many new, interesting things, and good discounts everywhere. Now she was rushing home, skillfully maneuvering through the passers-by, of whom there were many near the shopping center at this hour. Suddenly, Sarah's attention was drawn by an old woman. Thin, stooped, in an old coat, her head wrapped in a gray down shawl, worn felt boots on her feet. The elderly woman's eyes were of an amazing light blue color, as if slightly faded. Eleanor was looking around, addressing one person, then another, but people didn't hear or see her, hurrying about their business, but Sarah couldn't pass by. Catching up with Eleanor, she stopped. The elderly woman seemed to understand that she finally had a listener. She looked Sarah directly in the eyes and whispered in a quiet voice, asking for help because she was in a desperate situation. Sarah saw that this was indeed the case. Judging by Eleanor's expression, she was in a state close to panic. Sarah asked in as gentle a tone as possible what had happened. The elderly stranger began to explain. She had come here for meat. There was a good shop in the basement here. While she was walking around, she put her hand in her pocket, and her wallet wasn't there. Only then did it hit her. She had forgotten it at home, left it on the bedside table. It was all the cat's fault. While she was chasing that scoundrel from the street, everything went out of her head. It was a good thing she had money for a one-way ticket in another pocket, so she got here without a problem. But now she didn't know how to get home. Sarah clarified if she needed money for the bus. Eleanor was embarrassed, saying she did. It felt awkward asking like this, like a beggar, but what could she do? Bus drivers were angry now. They wouldn't take her for free, and she also needed an intercity bus. She lived outside the city, in a Dacha settlement. She had tried to go back, asked a driver if he would take her without money. He had chewed her out, in front of all the passengers so badly that she was afraid to ask anyone else now. Sarah was genuinely surprised. Hadn't any of the passengers helped? Eleanor looked dejected, replying that no, there weren't many people there, fortunately. Otherwise, the driver would have humiliated her even more. Sarah said it was okay, of course, she would help. She readily reached into her wallet. The elderly woman was almost in tears with gratitude, saying a huge thank you, wishing health to such a good, caring person. She asked for an address or phone number so her son could transfer the money later. Sarah smiled, saying it wasn't necessary. It wasn't hard for her to help, as good people had also helped her in a difficult moment. Eleanor thanked her again, calling her a good person. Sarah nodded and continued on her way, hurrying home where Emily was waiting for her. Sarah spent a wonderful evening with Emily. They indulged in ice cream and pizza, watched movies, lying cuddled up on the sofa. At such moments, Sarah felt happy, protected. What warm and cozy evenings they were. She waited all week for Friday precisely to relax and rest like this in her daughter's company. Sometimes, very rarely, on weekends, Sarah would go out somewhere with friends or colleagues, to the cinema, a bar, a nightclub. If Martha somehow found out about this outing, an obligatory visit from the guardianship authorities would immediately follow. And how did Martha manage to find out about her former daughter-in-law's personal life? Was she spying on her? Friends thought Sarah should find a man long ago. A colleague urged her, saying she was young, beautiful, but always alone. That wasn't right. Emily would grow up, she would start her own life. And what would Sarah do? Remain alone? Sarah just smiled and shook her head. After her ex-husband's betrayal, all men seemed like deceivers to her. No, she didn't want to date anyone at all, go on dates again, hope for an ideal person again, and then be bitterly disappointed. No way. And honestly, she didn't have time for romances. Work, a child, household chores and problems, and all this on her fragile shoulders. No thank you. She wasn't up to it at all. Saturday morning in Sarah and Emily's family always started late. Mother and daughter preferred to sleep in after a hard work week and getting up at 6 a.m. But this time, the sleepy silence of the apartment was broken by a sharp, piercing ring. Sarah barely opened her eyelids and looked at the clock. It was only 10. I wonder who decided to disturb them so early on a Saturday. Neighbors, probably. Sarah reluctantly got out of bed and put on her robe. A sleepy Emily was already coming out of her room, so sweet and funny in her silly pajamas with bears. Well, the morning visitor hadn't let the girl lie peacefully in bed. Meanwhile, the doorbell rang a second time. "I'm coming," Sarah shouted, trying not to sound too angry. She looked through the peephole and anxiety immediately gripped her. A man was standing on the landing, tall, young, unfamiliar. It wasn't a neighbor. "Who is it?" Sarah asked. The man at the door introduced himself, giving his name, and said he had a few questions for her. Sarah asked if he was from the police or Child Protective Services, used to visits from officials who usually introduce themselves with their full name and rank. But here? The man replied that he wasn't from the police. He was the son of the old woman she had given money for a ticket to yesterday. Ah, that's what this is about, Sarah thought. The elderly woman had sent her son after all, so he could return the money. But how did this man know her address? Emily hadn't given it to that old woman yesterday. Strange and very suspicious. The man's voice came from behind the door again. He understood that she was afraid to open, and that was right. One had to be vigilant nowadays. He suggested she come out of the building and wait for him on the porch. They would talk there. Sarah agreed it was the most reasonable option. At the same time, the stranger's morning visit still seemed strange and suspicious. Sarah's main concern was, how had this man found her? Sarah looked out the window. The man was indeed standing near the entrance waiting for her. It was a little scary to leave the apartment. What if this man was a criminal and his accomplice was still on the landing? But there was no one near the door. Sarah went downstairs. The man met her on the porch. He started the conversation by saying he had a delicate question. Sarah immediately tensed. Something told her the conversation would be unpleasant. She asked what was wrong. The man explained that his mother was very old. Age, not everything was right in her head. She wasn't incapacitated, of course, but his mother was like a child. Did she understand? Sarah nodded, knowing that with age, many people became childlike. And although yesterday's old woman hadn't given that impression, if her son said so, it must be true. But what did that have to do with her? The man continued that yesterday his mother had been in a desperate situation, without money, far from home. Perhaps she was in despair, which is why she offered her item in exchange for a bus ticket. What item? Sarah was genuinely surprised. The old woman hadn't offered her any item. The only thing she asked for was a phone number to transfer the money. What do you mean, what item? The man looked at her intently. Something hostile appeared in his whole demeanor. Sarah repeated that the old woman hadn't given her anything. Absolutely nothing. She just asked for money, Sarah gave it, and that was all. The man replied that she was lying. There were witnesses who saw and heard everything. In fact, it was thanks to them that he found her. An acquaintance of his worked nearby and had seen the whole scene and noticed which entrance she went into. And finding her there wasn't difficult. He just asked the neighbors which apartment she lived in, describing her appearance based on his friend's words. I don't understand anything, Sarah shook her head. What was he accusing her of? The man curled his lips contemptuously, saying she seemed like a brilliant actress. He admitted that he had hoped it was all a misunderstanding. By the way, it was a brooch, their family heirloom. Not only was it worth a considerable sum on its own, but it was also an antique, did she understand? It was worth a fortune. And you think I have it? Sarah asked. The man replied, who else would? Did she give the old woman money for the bus yesterday? Yes. Well, she offered the brooch in return. Perhaps she took it without realizing how valuable, how expensive it was. The man seemed to be giving her a last chance to get out of the situation with dignity. Sarah repeated that she hadn't seen any brooch. It was some kind of misunderstanding. The man said his mother said she gave it to the girl who paid for her fare. That was her, so she had the brooch. No, how can I prove it to you? Sarah exclaimed. The man suggested she just return the jewelry, and that would be it. He had a witness, and his mother would confirm in court, if necessary, that she took the jewelry from her. In court? Sarah felt cold, sticky goosebumps crawl down her back. Was this man really going to sue her? This is absurd. But he had a witness. Apparently he did. Otherwise, how would he have found her so quickly? What if I can't prove anything in court? What if I'm accused of extortion? After all, no one is immune to judicial errors. There are so many such cases. Sarah clutched her head. She couldn't become a defendant now, or even a suspect. Absolutely not. Martha was aware of her every step. She would surely find out about this whole story immediately and, of course, use it to her advantage. Problems with the law for the mother? That was already a significant argument for the guardianship authorities. They could take her daughter. She couldn't let that happen. The man spoke again in a soft, insinuating voice. If she had already gotten rid of the brooch somewhere, perhaps she knew they would be looking for it. So she sold it as quickly as possible. Then she should return the money at least. He named a figure that made Sarah's head spin. She couldn't save that much in several years, and she probably wouldn't get a loan. The previous one wasn't paid off yet, and her salary wouldn't allow it. Unless she got one somewhere at a high interest rate. How would she live then? On what? The situation seemed hopeless. She couldn't allow a court case because in that case, Martha would finally get a chance to get custody of her granddaughter. But there was nowhere to get the money either. You're mistaken. Sarah tried to reach the man again. She hadn't taken the brooch, and she didn't have the money. Excellent. Then we'll settle everything through court. The man nodded. The jewelry was insured. If they proved her guilt, which he personally didn't doubt, they would at least receive compensation. But she would have big problems in that case. Wait, Sarah exclaimed. Give her some time to think. This trouble had fallen on her so unexpectedly, she didn't even know what to do. The man repeated, just give back the jewelry or return the money. Sarah shook her head. She wanted to scream right in the face of the negative person that she hadn't taken anything, but perhaps it wasn't worth making him angry, because her fate now depended on him. I need time. All right, the man nodded. But she shouldn't think too long. They would exchange phone numbers. He would call the day after tomorrow. He hoped she would have found the money by then or finally decided to return the brooch. Because otherwise they would talk differently and most likely in court. The man turned sharply and walked toward the parking lot. Sarah watched him for a long time. Mom, what happened? Emily looked at her mother, who had returned after the unpleasant conversation with fright. She was so pale. Who was that man? Oh, just an old acquaintance. Nothing serious, Sarah smiled strainly. Shall we make pancakes? Remember you promised to teach me? Of course. Emily and Sarah spent about an hour in the kitchen. The girl cheerfully chattered about her friends and teachers. Sarah nodded, smiled where necessary, was surprised where necessary, praised her. But her thoughts were far away. She was thinking about how to get out of this strange situation. The man wouldn't give up, that was obvious. He had gotten it into his head that she had appropriated an expensive brooch, and nothing would dissuade him. That old woman? Why did she say that about her? Maybe Eleanor really wasn't herself and didn't know what she was saying? Or had the elderly woman, having lost the brooch, invented a story for her son so he wouldn't scold her? Judging by how the man behaved, he could be tough, even cruel, cold gaze, jerky movements. Anyway, Sarah now had to decide something. She absolutely couldn't become a suspect now. It was unknown whether she would be able to prove her innocence. Only one option remained: find the money. But where? There was no one to help. Her parents themselves lived in poverty. Her salary was good, of course, but the suddenly fallen debt wouldn't be covered even in several years. And she probably wouldn't get a loan. There was only one way out: turn to her ex-husband. The main thing was that David didn't blab to his mother, and he would quickly figure out how to turn the situation to his advantage. Martha had long dreamed of taking Emily, and David didn't need Emily, that was clear. He wouldn't fight for her. She would have to swallow her resentment and pride and call her ex-husband. How difficult was that? How unbearably difficult. But what else could she do? He had never participated in Emily's life, except for the meager alimony that landed on her card every month. Maybe, just this once, he would help. For him, the amount the man was demanding wasn't that large. Sarah sent Emily to watch cartoons and dialed the number she hadn't used in many years. David answered immediately. She said, "Hi, we need to talk." He asked in a rather indifferent tone if something was wrong with Emily. Sarah replied that no, but it concerned that too. Something had happened to her. They met that evening at a cafe. He used to invite her here for dates. Many years ago, they sold wonderful strawberry eclairs here, but they weren't on the menu anymore. David showed with his whole demeanor that he had little time. He asked what had happened to her. 5 years had passed since their divorce. He had hardly changed during that time. He still looked like a carefree guy from a youth series, a stylish regular at nightclubs. Perhaps Martha was right. He was an eternal boy. Sarah briefly told her ex-husband what had happened. A mocking look appeared in his eyes. He said that something like this could only happen to her. He was a typical scammer. Threaten him with a police report. Sarah sighed, saying that he was going to report her to the police and she couldn't get involved with them. He knew himself, his mother. She was just waiting for the right moment to take Emily. David sighed sadly, saying, "Mother, mother," that he was fed up with it too. She was always nagging him to sue for Emily. Why would he need that? And a child was always better off with their mother. Sarah nodded and then asked again, so, would he help her, lend her the money? Without interest, she would pay it back little by little from each salary. No, David replied. He wasn't going to sponsor criminals. He would demand even more later. Those were the kind of people they were. You couldn't feed them. Sarah sighed. She had already realized she wouldn't get help from him. And besides, turning to him was a mistake. David's parting advice was that when the man called, she should say that a report on him was already at the police station. Then he paid the bill and left the cafe with long, sweeping strides. And Sarah was left alone with her problem again. Yes, she understood that the man might be a scammer. But what if he wasn't? She couldn't risk it at all, because Martha was not sleeping. Just recently, she had informed the guardianship authorities that her daughter-in-law went out at night and didn't look after the child, and all because Sarah had gone to a friend's birthday party. Emily had indeed stayed home alone at that time, brushed her teeth herself, made her bed, and went to sleep. Sarah returned when Emily was already asleep. How did Martha find out about everything? Very simply, she saw a photo of Sarah on one of her friend's pages, compared the dates and times, and used the picture as proof. Sarah was advised then to hire a nanny for such cases, but they also sympathized. Living under such close scrutiny was difficult. Martha's persistence and desire to take her granddaughter scared Sarah more and more. If she found out about a court case now, she would use all her connections to fulfill her long-held dream. No, Sarah wouldn't give her that chance. What should she do? Sarah decided to walk home. The road wasn't very short, but the weather was wonderful. Spring, the sun was shining, birds were singing, the sky was clear and very blue, not a cloud in sight. The snow was melting literally before her eyes. Bare patches had already appeared on the asphalt. Before, Sarah always felt a surge of emotion at such moments. Nature was waking up. Her favorite time of year, summer, was not far off. But today her heart was heavy. A completely overwhelming problem had suddenly fallen upon her. How to solve it? look for money, or try to prove to the man that she had nothing to do with it. Both options seemed unworkable. Sarah was walking past the same shopping center near which she had met Eleanor. Imagine, they had to run into each other that evening. If she had gone home later or earlier, none of this would have happened. She would have lived peacefully, enjoying the coming spring, the sun, the upcoming vacation. And suddenly, Sarah stopped as if struck by lightning. She even blinked her eyes several times to make sure she wasn't imagining it. That same old woman was walking through the parking lot, the coat, the down shawl, and the eyes of an incredible light blue shade. Next to the elderly woman, carefully supporting her by the elbow so she wouldn't slip on the melting snow, walked a young man. And it wasn't the one who had called her. He was short, fair-haired, with a pleasant open face and eyes exactly like the old woman's. He was smiling and telling the elderly woman something. She listened attentively, occasionally interjecting her own remarks. The pair was walking away. They would probably get into this man's car and leave soon. No, she couldn't let that happen. Fate itself had given Sarah a unique chance to get out of a difficult situation. Now she would talk to the old woman, and perhaps everything would become clear. Sarah hurried after the man and the elderly woman across the parking lot. Perhaps they were in league with that other man, and another unpleasant conversation awaited her. But it was worth trying, wasn't it? "Wait!" Sarah shouted to the old woman and the man as they were almost disappearing around the corner. The elderly woman was the first to turn around. For a moment she scrutinized Sarah, squinting her nearsighted eyes, and Eleanor's face lit up with a smile. Apparently, she recognized the passerby who had given her money for her fare a couple of days ago. The man, on the other hand, saw Sarah for the first time, and therefore looked questioningly at the stranger hurrying towards them at full speed. "Hello," Sarah breathed out, catching up with the pair. "Good afternoon," the man greeted her. "Hello, daughter." Eleanor smiled warmly. She recognized her. She was the one who helped then. "Thank you very much." The man, finally understanding what was going on, also smiled. So, she was the one who hadn't passed by his mother then? She had told him how desperate she was, and people had rushed past without paying attention. Only she had responded. "So you are also her son?" Sarah clarified. "What do you mean, also?" Eleanor was surprised. Her companion was her only son, late, long awaited. Before him she had only daughters born. 4 daughters, all much older than her son. The older ones were already grandmothers themselves. But what about that other man? Sarah stared wide-eyed at the mother and son. "What Mark?" Eleanor frowned. She didn't seem to know anyone like that. "Did something happen to you?" Robert finally guessed. And was it somehow connected to the time she met his mother? Right? Sarah nodded silently. She still didn't understand anything. One thing was clear. That man was indeed a scammer, and now it was absolutely certain. But many questions remained. And the main one, how to act now? A scammer. Sarah had fallen into his sight. Who knew how he would behave? What if he started threatening her, or even did something to her? Or, God forbid, to Emily? How terrifying. "Tell us what happened," the man asked gently. "Well, it's not your problems. Why bother you with extra worries? Just please leave your phone number because it might be needed soon. Tell us." The man gently stroked Sarah's shoulder. This friendly gesture changed a lot. Sarah suddenly realized that she wanted to share her story with this person. Very much so. "First, I should probably introduce myself," she sighed. Her name was Sarah. That evening she was returning from work, came out of the shopping center, and saw an elderly woman who was asking people something, but everyone was hurrying about their business. And Sarah told them everything, how she gave the old woman money for the fare, about the morning call, and the conversation with the man, mentioning her own doubts and anxieties. She had to share details of her personal life with her listeners. How else would they understand why Sarah hadn't gone to the police immediately? The man listened without interrupting. His mother occasionally shook her head, clicked her tongue, and sighed, sometimes interjecting angry, condemning remarks. She would roll over the scammer, then Martha. Her former mother-in-law got it, and her ex-husband, who hadn't helped the mother of his child in a difficult moment. What a monster! Eleanor shook her head. He understood that the man was a scammer. Well, he could have met him, talked to him man to man. "Yes, dear girl, you're having a tough time in this life. All by yourself. After listening to Sarah, the man thought about her story in silence for a while. Meanwhile, his mother showered Sarah with words of support. It was clear that she sincerely wanted to cheer her up, instill confidence that everything would be all right. From this care, tears even appeared in Sarah's eyes, but she quickly blinked them back. It wasn't time to relax now. "We will expose this scammer," the man finally declared, and he said it so convincingly that Sarah felt with every cell of her body she was no longer alone, she had protection. It was strange, unexpected. After all, the man and his mother were complete strangers. Yet Sarah had not the slightest doubt. He knew what to do in this situation. He had a good friend who worked in the investigative committee. He himself had started there but later went into business. He needed money urgently. His father was very ill. He would call his friend right now, and he would keep Sarah informed of what was happening. She would have to come and give a statement. When exactly? He didn't know yet, but definitely soon. Sarah nodded. Yes, now it wasn't scary to turn to law enforcement representatives. "Thank you," Sarah said. "Thank you for your concern. Why wouldn't I help a good person?" The man smiled. This smile warmed Sarah's heart. After all, she hadn't passed by his mother when she was in need of help either, and she had fallen into this terrible situation only because of them. On the way home, Sarah replayed the details of that conversation in her mind again and again. Imagine. Was it really true? She was seriously afraid that her meeting with this man was just her imagination. What if her brain, desperately searching for a way out of a difficult situation, had simply invented this scene? No, of course, that couldn't be. And yet, there were doubts. The man called a couple of hours later. Sarah hadn't expected such speed. At first, she jumped at the sharp ringing of her mobile phone. Cold, sticky fear gripped her heart. What if it was that man again? Would he start threatening, accusing, scaring her again? But the man's cheerful voice came through the receiver. He asked if she could be on such and such a street in 40 minutes. They were waiting for her in such and such an office. They were already informed. Of course. Well, then everything happened with dizzying speed. The man was already waiting for Sarah on the steps of a tall building with massive columns. Seeing him, she felt relief. He was there, so everything would be all right. He escorted her to Detective Miller's office. The detective asked questions about the scammer. Sarah described the appearance and behavior of the man who had introduced himself as the son of the supposedly deceived old woman. Detective Miller said finally, "If he calls, stall for time." They were working on this guy, starting to gather evidence, but they needed at least a couple of days. She should tell him she was arranging loans or something like that. Her phone was being tapped, by the way. She knew that she had signed the consent herself, so they would hear everything he said to her. Sarah nodded silently. The man offered to drive her home. She gladly agreed. Not because she didn't want to trudge to the bus stop. No, it was so great to spend some more time with this person. Sarah was surprised at herself. She had only known him for a short time, but next to him she felt such calmness, such peace, that she didn't want to part with this man at all. What was this? The beginning of some feelings? Or was it simply a manifestation of gratitude to a person who hadn't remained indifferent to her trouble? What did it matter? The main thing was they would see each other again. The case wasn't closed yet, and the man had promised to see it through to the end. So that's how it would be. That evening, the scammer called Sarah again. On Detective Miller's advice, she asked for a postponement. Sarah asked a question just to make him confirm his claims. "You still won't believe that I didn't take any brooch?" There was no brooch. But the man stubbornly insisted that Sarah had tricked the elderly person and swindled the valuable item. "Aren't you tired of pretending?" he hissed. She had the brooch. She took it from his mother, taking advantage of her helpless state, and now she was denying it too. He was calling the police. No. Sarah pretended to be scared. She couldn't become a suspect now. The situation was such that it was easier to pay the money. She had already started applying for a loan, but the procedure wasn't quick. He would have to wait. How long? About 2 days? All right, I'll call again. And the scammer hung up. Sarah exhaled with relief. She had done it. She had managed to gain a couple of days, as the detective had asked. The rest of the evening passed as usual. Sarah helped Emily with another project. They cooked dinner together, played a little Monopoly. Sarah tried not to think about the man, but she couldn't help it. She kept remembering his light blue eyes and wide smile. She checked herself. Most likely he wasn't single. Maybe he even had a wife and children. She was already dreaming. If so, his other half was lucky. Being next to such a person was immense happiness. The next day also flew by, unremarkable. But then during her lunch break, Sarah's mobile phone rang cheerfully. The name on the screen was Robert. Sarah's heart gave a sweet flutter. At the same time, an unpleasant chill appeared in her stomach. Who knew what news he was calling with? The man suggested meeting at a cafe near the building where Sarah worked. Just in case, she warned her boss about a possible delay returning from her lunch break and hurried to the cafe. The man was already waiting for her at a table. He looked calm and happy. Sarah immediately understood from his expression. Everything was all right. She involuntarily admired him. High cheekbones, confidence, a calm gaze. "Good afternoon." The man rose from his seat and pulled out a chair for Sarah. Pure gallantry. He had some news. Good news. More than good. He would start with the main thing. The scammer had been caught. It turned out he had many victims under investigation simultaneously. Right now, about 5, and that was only those they had managed to identify. 5? Sarah, strangely enough, was even a little pleased by this information. It turned out she wasn't the only naive fool who had fallen for it. 5, the man confirmed, and then he told her details about the man who had demanded the expensive antique brooch. It turned out he had grown up in an orphanage. He didn't want to work in the profession he had learned there. A plasterer painter had to work hard, and he didn't like that. He liked a beautiful life and easy money. At first, the guy was a pickpocket, got caught a couple of times, but he was lucky. The victims were moved by the orphan's pitiful story and withdrew their statements. He realized that operating in that role was risky, so he started acting more subtly. The young man figured out that there were many trusting and simply foolish people in the world, and that's who he could make money from without much effort. He started scamming people over the phone. Many, without going into details, transferred quite decent sums to his cards. Sometimes he himself was surprised by the size of the transfers. But over time, it became more difficult to work. Too risky, hard not to leave traces. He was invited to work for companies professionally engaged in such phone calls. Being caught there was practically minimal, but he dreamed of a solo career. The guy had no lack of imagination or attentiveness. He liked to invent new schemes, compose incredible stories. This was probably how his creative side manifested. With Sarah, it turned out especially interesting. He accidentally saw her in court one day. She had ended up there again because of her former mother-in-law. Sarah had easily proven then that she was perfectly capable of raising her own daughter independently. But the scammer immediately realized Sarah clearly wouldn't want to become the heroine of a detective story, to fall under the police's radar. And that meant she was an excellent potential victim. She wouldn't just not report him, she could even be scared with the police. Here he hit the nail on the head. He knew how to draw conclusions. So Sarah became a potential victim. Now the scammer occasionally followed her, waiting for a convenient moment. But the opportunity never presented itself. Sarah's life was measured, monotonous, even boring in his opinion. The guy wasn't worried. He always had work. People fell into his nets just like that. And it was always some completely unique story. He was especially proud of some of his exploits. Once, he managed to get an old woman from a neighboring house to sign over her apartment to him. He convinced the elderly woman that he was the child of her deceased son. It turned out to be easy. The elderly lady herself very much wanted to believe in the suddenly appeared grandson. The old woman was lonely, reclusive. Her only relative was a brother who expected to inherit the apartment after his sister's death. But it didn't happen. The apartment became the scammer's property. It all came out only after that grandmother had passed away. True, such big fish didn't fall into his net anymore, but the scammer wasn't worried about that. Greed wasn't good, even dangerous, and then suddenly, quite by chance, he noticed Sarah helping an unfamiliar old woman, and a plan instantly formed in his head. The story just came together on its own. There was only one thing he didn't account for. Robert smiled. She accidentally ran into that very old woman near the shopping center. The probability was minimal. His mother lived far from there, and the scammer, of course, had found that out before acting. That's how circumstances aligned. "I can't even believe it," Sarah said. "And what would happen to him now?" "He'll go where he belongs," the man replied. "He'll sit and think about his behavior." Detective Miller pulled the strings. So many other victims were discovered. Many of them had already given statements. Some were still preparing to. In short, romance and creativity were waiting for a bunk. Sarah still couldn't believe that the problem that had poisoned her life for these few days no longer existed. It was great that everything had been resolved so well and successfully, but what next? Did this mean there was nothing connecting her and this man anymore? He would leave this cafe now, and that was it? The conversation seemed to have reached a logical conclusion. All Sarah had to do was thank him again for his help. The man took a deep breath and said that he didn't want her to think he was taking advantage of his role as a savior, all that. But if he invited her to the cinema tonight, what would she say? Sarah felt a pleasant warmth spread in her chest. What would she say? Yes! She had to keep herself in check with all her might so as not to scream with joy right now. Apparently, her emotions were clearly visible on her face, because the man understood everything and smiled.